Imagine you wake up tomorrow, but everything you know is gone. No running water, no electricity, no medicine. The year is somewhere around 1200, and you are not a king. You are not a knight. You are one of the roughly 90% of people in medieval Europe who will spend every waking hour trying not to starve, not to freeze, and not to die of something that today a single pill could cure. And here is the question that should genuinely unsettle you. Could you survive even a single week? We have been sold a version of the Middle Ages that is almost entirely fiction. A world of gleaming castles, noble quests, courtly love, and heroic tournaments. But what did medieval life actually look like for the people who lived it? What did a knight really do when he was not fighting, and what force, more than any king or army, truly shaped the fate of every person in medieval Europe? Stay with this story, because the real Middle Ages are stranger, harder, and in many ways more fascinating than anything the fantasy versions ever showed you. Let us begin where almost everyone in medieval Europe began their day. In a field. The sun is barely up over a village somewhere in northern France, or England, or the Rhine Valley. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. A man we might call Thomas, though his name is lost to history because ordinary people rarely made it into records, pulls on rough-spun wool clothing that he has probably been wearing for weeks. He walks out of a one-room structure made of timber, mud, and thatch that he shares with his wife, his children, and quite possibly his animals during the coldest months. The floor is packed dirt. The smoke from the central hearth has no chimney to escape through, just a hole in the roof, so the walls are perpetually blackened and the air inside is thick enough to sting your eyes. Thomas is what historians call a serf, or in some regions a villain. He is not technically a slave, but the distinction in practice is often thin. He is bound to the land of a lord, which means he cannot simply leave and seek a better life elsewhere without permission. In exchange for the right to farm strips of the lord's land, he owes that lord a portion of everything he grows, labor on the lord's own fields for a set number of days each week, and a collection of fees for everything from using the lord's mill to grind his grain, to getting married, to dying and leaving property to his children. Here is a wow fact that tends to stop people cold. In some regions of medieval Europe, a peasant family could owe so many different fees, dues, and labor obligations that historians estimate they spent between 1/3 and 1/2 of their productive time and output working not for themselves but for the Lord, the Church, and the King simultaneously. And this was during a good year. The structure that made all of this possible had a name: feudalism. The word itself is actually a much later invention, coined by historians trying to describe a system that was never formally designed or declared by anyone. It emerged organically from the chaos that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. When Rome fell, it took with it the roads, the courts, the currency networks, and the centralized military that had kept order across an enormous territory. What filled the vacuum was a patchwork of local power, where the person who could protect you, feed you, and defend the village against raiders was the person you owed your loyalty and your labor to. And this is where a popular myth deserves to be dismantled early. Many people assume that the medieval period was one long, static dark age, a frozen moment between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. This is not accurate. Medieval Europe was in constant motion, constantly changing, and in several specific centuries, it was genuinely innovative. The heavy plough that transformed northern European agriculture, the horse collar that allowed horses to pull loads without choking, the three-field rotation system that dramatically increased food yields, all of these emerged and spread during the medieval period and represented genuine technological leaps that changed the material conditions of millions of lives. But progress was slow, uneven, and fragile. And for most people, the dominant experience of life was not progress. It was precarity. The church stood at the center of everything. Not as a background institution, but as the organizing force of daily life. The calendar, the law, the meaning-making system, and the largest landowner in most of medieval Europe. The Catholic Church, and we are speaking here specifically of Western Christendom before the Reformation, was not simply a religious body. It was a political power, an economic engine, and a social welfare network all at once. It ran the hospitals, which were called hospitals but functioned more like places where the sick could pray and be cared for by monks and nuns than places where disease was scientifically treated. It ran the schools, which were almost exclusively attached to monasteries and cathedrals. It collected its own taxes, called tithes, requiring 1/10 of a household's income or produce. It operated its own courts, and it held a spiritual authority so complete that excommunication, being cut off from the sacraments of the Church, was considered by most medieval people to be a fate worse than physical death. When Pope Gregory VII and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV clashed in the 10,050s in a dispute over who had the authority to appoint church officials, the emperor was forced to stand barefoot in the snow outside a castle in northern Italy for 3 days in January, begging the pope to lift his excommunication. A sitting emperor in the snow barefoot for 3 days. This single image tells you more about the real balance of power in medieval Europe than almost any battle. Now let us talk about the knights, because this is where the fantasy diverges most dramatically from reality. The knight of legend is a lone hero, pure of heart, riding out to fight evil for the love of a lady and the glory of God. The historical knight was something considerably more complicated. He was, first and foremost, a professional warrior in an era when warfare was essentially a business. Becoming a knight required resources. A war horse alone, a destrier trained for combat, could cost the equivalent of several years of a skilled craftsman's wages. The armor, the weapons, the training from childhood, the squire who maintained your equipment, all of this required either inherited wealth or the patronage of a lord who expected a return on that investment in the form of military service. The chivalric code, the set of ideals governing knightly behavior, was real in the sense that it was written about, preached about, and genuinely aspired to. But historians are careful to distinguish between the ideal and the practice. Knights in actual warfare did not always spare non-combatants. Chevauchée, a deliberate military strategy used extensively during the 100 Years' War, involved knights and their armies systematically burning crops, destroying villages, and driving off livestock across enemy territory, precisely to terrorize the civilian population and undermine the enemy lord's ability to project power. This was not a violation of chivalry. It was accepted military doctrine. Here is something that complicates the romantic image further. Many knights spent the vast majority of their adult lives not fighting at all. Between campaigns, a knight was essentially a local administrator, a debt collector, and a landlord. He managed estates, settled disputes among peasants, collected rents, and tried to maintain the income needed to keep himself equipped and ready for the next time his lord called. The tournament, which we imagine as a glorious spectacle of martial skill, began as a genuinely brutal training exercise where men were injured and killed regularly. It evolved over the centuries into something more regulated and theatrical, partly because the church repeatedly condemned tournaments as wasteful and sinful, and partly because they were, in fact, killing too many expensive trained warriors. But now we need to talk about the force that, more than any king or knight, shaped the trajectory of medieval Europe. And it arrived not with swords, but invisibly. The Black Death reached Europe in 1347, carried on trading ships from the Black Sea into the port of Messina in Sicily. Within 18 months, it had spread across the continent with a speed and lethality that had no precedent in recorded European history. Estimates vary because record-keeping was incomplete and inconsistent, but most historians now believe that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population died within roughly 4 years. Some regions lost 60 or even 70% of their population. Entire villages were abandoned. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were left empty. In some areas, there were not enough living people to bury the dead. The psychological impact is almost impossible to fully convey. Medieval people understood disease through a religious and moral framework. Plague was God's punishment. The question was for what sin and how to respond. Flagellant movements emerged. Groups of people who traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves as acts of penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells and massacred in pogroms, a catastrophic and utterly baseless persecution that the Pope himself condemned at the time, though with limited effect on the violence. But here is the historical twist that changes everything. The Black Death, as catastrophic as it was, became one of the most significant engines of social change in medieval European history. And this is the turning point that we need to sit with, because it is genuinely counterintuitive. When between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population dies, the fundamental economic logic of feudalism breaks down. Suddenly, there are far fewer laborers available to work the land. Lords who had spent centuries keeping peasants bound to their estates through legal and economic coercion now faced a labor market that had, almost overnight, tilted dramatically in the workers' favor. Peasants began demanding wages instead of owing labor. They began moving from village to village, seeking better terms. Some lords tried to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels, as the English Parliament did with the Statute of Labourers in 1351. But laws cannot resurrect dead workers, and the pressure kept building. In 1381, in England, it exploded. The Peasants' Revolt, led by figures including Wat Tyler and inspired in part by the radical preaching of John Ball, who asked the famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" brought tens of thousands of peasants marching on London. They burned legal records, targeted the symbols of feudal obligation, and briefly occupied the Tower of London. The revolt was ultimately suppressed, and its leaders were executed. But the feudal system in England never fully recovered its pre-plague form. Serfdom effectively ended in England within roughly a century of the revolt, not because lords became generous, but because the economic conditions that made serfdom viable had been permanently disrupted. This is the pattern that runs through medieval history again and again. The system was not static. It was always being negotiated, resisted, and reshaped by the people living inside it. Now let us look at the cities, because the medieval city is another place where reality diverges sharply from both the fantasy version and from the assumption that everything was simply grim and brutal. Medieval cities were small by modern standards. London in 1300 probably had somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 inhabitants. Paris was somewhat larger. Most cities were far smaller than that, but within those walls a genuinely different kind of society existed. Cities in medieval Europe were, in many cases, legally distinct from the surrounding feudal countryside. A serf who escaped to a city and remained there for a year and a day was, in many jurisdictions, legally free. The German phrase that captured this principle was Stadtluft macht frei. City air makes you free. Cities were noisy, crowded, and by modern sanitary standards extraordinarily unhealthy. Streets were narrow and often unpaved. Waste disposal was haphazard at best, but they were also centers of commerce, craft, learning, and a kind of social mobility that the countryside rarely offered. The guild system, which organized craftsmen and merchants into regulated professional associations, provided a structure through which a skilled person could rise from apprentice to master craftsman to a position of genuine local influence. Women participated in guild economies more than is often acknowledged, particularly in textile production, brewing, and retail trade, though they faced significant legal and social constraints. The medieval university, which emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, was another genuinely remarkable institution. These were not schools in the modern sense. They were corporations of scholars, often chaotic, politically contentious, and fiercely independent. Students were frequently young, poor, and rowdy. Town and gown conflicts, meaning clashes between university students and the local city population, were common and sometimes deadly. But within their walls, ideas were being debated, synthesized, and transmitted that would eventually feed directly into the intellectual transformations of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Here is a wow fact that tends to genuinely surprise people. The medieval period produced several thinkers whose ideas about logic, natural philosophy, and the relationship between faith and reason were so sophisticated that they are still taught in philosophy departments today. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, constructed a synthesis of Aristotelian logic and Christian theology that shaped Western intellectual life for centuries. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar working around the same time, wrote about the importance of empirical observation and experiment in understanding the natural world in terms that anticipate the scientific method by several hundred years. These were not men waiting to be rescued from the Dark Ages. They were genuinely original thinkers working at the frontier of what was knowable. But let us return to the question of what daily life actually felt like. Because the texture of lived experience in medieval Europe was shaped by forces that we rarely talk about. Pain was constant and largely unmanaged. Dental disease was widespread. Infections that today would be cleared by antibiotics were potentially fatal. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and child. Life expectancy figures for the medieval period are often misunderstood. The average life expectancy at birth was low, somewhere in the 30s or 40s depending on the region and era. But this was heavily dragged down by extremely high infant and child mortality. A person who survived to the age of 20 had a reasonable chance of living into their 50s or 60s. But those years were lived in bodies that experienced far more physical suffering than most people in wealthy countries today can easily imagine. The medieval diet is another area where reality is more nuanced than the stereotype. The image of medieval people gnawing on great hunks of meat at feasts is accurate for the nobility, who ate a diet heavily weighted toward meat and wine. But for the majority of the population, the diet was dominated by bread, pottage, a thick grain-based stew with whatever vegetables were available, legumes, and ale. Ale, importantly, was not primarily drunk for its alcohol content. It was drunk because water sources were frequently contaminated and ale, having been boiled in its production, was safer. Children drank weak ale. This is one of those facts that sounds shocking until you understand the logic behind it. Seasonal hunger was a real and recurring experience for much of the peasant population. The period between when winter stores ran out and the first spring harvests came in was called, in some traditions, the hungry gap. In bad years, it was not just hunger, it was starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, caused by a series of catastrophically wet and cold summers that destroyed harvests across northern Europe, killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population in the worst affected areas. People ate seed grain, which meant the next year's harvest would also fail. They ate animals they could not afford to lose. Historical records from this period describe scenes of desperation that are difficult to read. And yet, and this is important to hold alongside all of that suffering, medieval people were not simply passive victims of their circumstances. They celebrated. They had a rich calendar of festivals, saints' days, and seasonal observances that punctuated the grinding routine of agricultural labor with moments of communal joy. Carnival, the period of feasting and revelry before Lent, was a genuine cultural institution in which social hierarchies were temporarily inverted. The poor could mock the rich, and the rules of ordinary life were suspended. Medieval music, poetry, and visual art were sophisticated and emotionally expressive. The great cathedrals of the medieval period, Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, Salisbury, were not just religious buildings. They were the most ambitious engineering projects of their age, constructed over generations by workers who knew they would never see them finished, and they are still standing. The relationship between medieval people and death was also profoundly different from our own. Death was visible, constant, and intimate in ways that modern societies have largely managed to conceal. Children grew up watching animals slaughtered. They saw public executions. They lived in communities where death from disease, accident, or childbirth was a regular occurrence. This produced not a culture of despair, but a culture that had developed elaborate rituals, beliefs, and artistic traditions for processing mortality. The danse macabre, the dance of death, an artistic motif that appeared across Europe after the Black Death, depicted death as a skeleton leading people of every social rank, pope and peasant alike, in a final dance. It was not simply morbid. It was a statement about equality in the face of mortality, a leveling image in a society defined by rigid hierarchy. The legacy of the medieval period is genuinely difficult to overstate. The institutions, the borders, the legal traditions, the languages, the religious identities, and the cultural forms that emerged from those centuries still shape the world we live in. The English common law tradition that influenced legal systems across the globe was developed and codified in the medieval period. The borders of many European nations reflect medieval political arrangements. The Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, and the theological disputes of the medieval period continue to shape the religious lives of hundreds of millions of people. The universities that train doctors, lawyers, scientists, and scholars today are direct institutional descendants of the medieval universities of Bologna and Paris. But perhaps the most important thing the real Middle Ages can teach us is something about the relationship between systems and the people who live inside them. Feudalism was not a natural order handed down from heaven, though the people who benefited from it often described it in exactly those terms. It was a human construction built to serve particular interests, and it was constantly being challenged, resisted, renegotiated, and eventually dismantled by the people it was supposed to contain. The peasants who demanded wages after the Black Death, the townspeople who built cities where a serf could become free, the scholars who argued that reason had its own authority. These were all acts of agency within a system that insisted on their passivity. The Middle Ages were not a dark age waiting to be rescued. They were a long, complicated, painful, creative, and deeply human period in which millions of people lived, struggled, built, believed, and died. They were not so different from us in their fears and their hopes. They were just working with far fewer tools. What do you think? Was the medieval system ultimately held together by force or by belief? Could it have survived without the church giving it moral legitimacy? Drop your answer in the comments, because the answers people give tend to be genuinely fascinating and divided. If you appreciate history that takes you past the myths and into the real texture of the past, subscribe. There are no filler facts here, no recycled legends, just the history as best we can reconstruct it. And in the next video, we are going to follow one specific thread out of the medieval world and into the crisis that shattered it permanently. The Reformation, the moment when the religious unity of Western Christendom cracked open, and why the consequences of that crack are still shaping politics, culture, and conflict in the world today. But before we get there, let us pause on one more dimension of medieval life that tends to get lost between the grand narratives of kings and plagues and revolts: the experience of women. The medieval church taught a theology that was deeply ambivalent about women. On one hand, the Virgin Mary occupied the highest position of any human being in the spiritual hierarchy, venerated across the entire Catholic world with a devotion that was, in practice, often more emotionally immediate than devotion to God the Father or even to Christ. On the other hand, the theological tradition inherited from figures like Tertullian and later interpreted through Augustine and Aquinas placed women in a subordinate position, associated with temptation, bodily weakness, and the need for male guidance and control. But here is where the reality of medieval women's lives becomes more complicated than either the idealized image or the purely oppressive one. Women in medieval Europe occupied an enormous range of social positions and exercised varying degrees of real power depending on their class, their location, and the specific circumstances of their lives. Noble women could, under certain conditions, inherit land, manage estates, and exercise genuine political authority. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th century, was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Queen of France through her first marriage, Queen of England through her second, and mother of 2 English kings. She outlived almost everyone who tried to contain her, dying at around 80 years old at a time when that age was genuinely extraordinary. She is not an exception that proves a rule of female powerlessness. She is evidence that the rule was always more contested than it appeared. At the other end of the social scale, peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, managed household economies that required considerable skill and judgment, and participated in the informal social networks that held village communities together. Their labor was essential and largely uncompensated in any formal sense, but it was not invisible to the people around them. Medieval village communities knew exactly who the capable women were, and informal authority often followed. The convent deserves particular attention. For a woman of the medieval period who wanted an education, intellectual engagement, or any form of life outside the structures of marriage and motherhood, the convent was often the only available path. And within convents, some women achieved levels of learning, artistic production, and institutional authority that would have been entirely unavailable to them in secular life. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess from the Rhine region of what is now Germany, composed music that is still performed today, wrote extensively on natural history and medicine, corresponded with popes and emperors, and undertook preaching tours at a time when women were formally prohibited from preaching. She did all of this within the framework of religious authority, using the language of divine vision to claim a space that no other language available to her could have secured. This is a pattern worth noticing. Medieval people, whether peasants demanding fairer terms after the Black Death, or scholars arguing for the authority of reason, or women navigating the constraints of a patriarchal church, consistently found ways to work within the available structures while quietly expanding what those structures permitted. That is not passivity. That is a form of intelligence adapted to the conditions of survival. There is one final element of medieval life that deserves to be named clearly, because it is perhaps the hardest for modern audiences to genuinely inhabit. The medieval sense of time was fundamentally different from our own. We live inside a conception of time that is linear, measurable, and oriented toward progress. The future is where things get better. The past is what we have moved beyond. Medieval people, for the most part, did not experience time this way. Their sense of time was cyclical, shaped by the agricultural seasons, the liturgical calendar of the church, and a theological framework in which human history was understood as a single arc between creation and the Last Judgment, with the present moment somewhere in the middle of uncertain duration. Progress in the modern sense was not really a category available to them. What was available was salvation, meaning the possibility of a good death, a clean conscience, and eternal life beyond the suffering of the present world. This is not a failure of imagination, it is a different relationship to existence, shaped by conditions of radical uncertainty that we have largely, though not entirely, escaped. When your children have a meaningful chance of dying before they reach adulthood. When a single bad harvest can mean starvation. When a disease you cannot see or understand can kill half your village in a season. The appeal of a worldview that promises ultimate meaning and ultimate justice beyond the chaos of the present is not hard to understand. It is, in fact, deeply rational. The medieval world was not a place we should romanticize. The suffering was real, the injustice was structural and deliberate, and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy paid an enormous price for the beauty and the grandeur that the people at the top could afford to create. But it was also not a world we should condescend to. The people who built the cathedrals, who argued philosophy in the university halls, who organized revolts and negotiated their way toward freedom, who composed music and wrote poetry and raised children and buried their dead with ceremony and love, those people were fully human. Their world shaped ours in ways we are still discovering. The real Middle Ages are worth knowing, not because they were glorious, but because they were true. What do you think was the single greatest force for change in medieval Europe? Was it the church, the plague, the peasants who refused to accept the terms they were given, or something else entirely? Leave your answer in the comments. The conversation there is always worth reading. If this kind of history is what you are looking for, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. No myths, no shortcuts, just the past as it actually was. And in the next video, we follow the thread forward into the crisis that broke the medieval world apart for good, the Protestant Reformation. The moment when a single monk's argument about salvation ignited a century of war, transformed the map of Europe, and planted the seeds of ideas about individual conscience and political authority that are still shaping the world you live in today.